The morning of July 25th, 1944, dawned hot and hazy over the hedgerow country of Normandy. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann crouched in a hastily dug foxhole near the Perriers-Saint-Lô road, his field-grey uniform already soaked with sweat despite the early hour. He had survived 3 years of war. He had endured the endless steppes of Russia, where winter could kill as efficiently as any bullet. He had heard the distinctive wail of Stalin's organ, those terrifying Katyusha rockets that screamed across the sky before saturating entire grid squares with high explosive. But nothing in his experience on the Eastern Front had prepared him for what was about to happen. At 0700 hours, the first wave arrived. Not tanks, not infantry, aircraft. Hundreds of them, their engines creating a thunder that seemed to shake the very earth beneath his feet. American fighter bombers, Thunderbolts and Lightnings, swept in low over the hedgerows. Behind them came the heavy bombers, Flying Fortresses, and Liberators, their bomb bays already open. Hartmann pressed himself deeper into the earth. He had learned to recognize the sound of different weapons, the sharp crack of artillery, the metallic rattle of machine gun fire, the deep crump of conventional high-explosive bombs. But when the first canisters began tumbling from the bomb bays, they made a different sound altogether. A whooshing, tumbling sound. And then came the fire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The napalm struck the hedgerow line 30 meters to Hartmann's right. He watched as the jellied gasoline exploded outward in a wave of flame that defied every natural law of combustion he understood. Regular fire burned upward. This fire spread horizontally, clinging to everything it touched, the thick Norman hedgerows that had provided such excellent cover against tanks and infantry now became death traps. The fire didn't simply burn over the vegetation, it baked through it, turning each defensive position into an oven. The screaming started almost immediately. Men in positions Hartmann knew were deep, well-constructed foxholes began emerging, their uniforms on fire. Some rolled on the ground, trying to extinguish flames that would not go out. Others simply ran, human torches fleeing toward the German rear. A few made it no more than a few steps before collapsing. This was different from the Katyusha barrages. Those were terrible, certainly. The howl of incoming rockets, the saturation effect of multiple impacts across a wide area, the random chance of survival that depended entirely on whether your particular square meter of earth received a direct hit. But the Katyushas killed quickly. You were there, and then you were not. The napalm was something else entirely. It killed slowly, it killed visibly, and it killed in a way that bypassed every defensive measure German doctrine had developed over 3 years of brutal warfare. Hartmann's squad leader, Unteroffizier Meyer, had fought at Stalingrad. He had survived the pocket. He had escaped the vast Soviet encirclements. In that moment, crouched in the Norman hedgerow with napalm turning the landscape into hell itself, Meyer said something Hartmann never forgot. His voice, usually so steady, carried an edge of something close to panic. I would rather face 10 Katyusha barrages than 5 more minutes of this. To understand why a veteran of the Eastern Front would make such a statement, it is necessary to understand what the Katyusha represented in German military experience. The BM-13 launcher, first deployed in combat in July 1941 near Orsha in Belarus, had earned its fearsome reputation through sheer destructive capacity. A battery of 4 launchers could deliver 4.35 tons of high explosive across an impact zone of 400,000 square meters in 7 to 10 seconds. German soldiers immediately recognized its effectiveness and its terror. The psychological impact was considerable. The rockets made a distinctive howling sound during flight, a noise that German troops compared to a church organ. They nicknamed it the Stalin-Orgel, Stalin's organ, a name that captured both the weapon's appearance, with its multiple launch rails arranged like organ pipes, and the terrible symphony it produced. That howl became one of the signature sounds of the Eastern Front, as recognizable and fear-inducing as the drone of Stuka dive bombers had been in the early war years. German infantry developed extensive doctrine for surviving Katyusha attacks. The weapons were inaccurate, effective for area saturation rather than precision strikes. German defensive positions became more dispersed. Troops learned to dig deeper, to create better overhead cover, to spread out so that a single salvo could not eliminate an entire company. Most importantly, they learned that the Katyusha barrage, while devastating, was finite. The launchers required significant time to reload. After the storm passed, there would be casualties to collect, positions to reman, and the grinding infantry battle to continue. Veterans of the Eastern Front carried this knowledge westward when they were transferred to defend against the anticipated Allied invasion. They brought with them hard-won experience of Soviet weapons and Soviet tactics. They knew the 34 tank, they knew the Maxim machine gun, they knew the sound of Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, and they knew the Katyusha. They had survived all of these. The Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine incorporated these lessons. The army that dug in along the Atlantic Wall and behind the Norman hedgerows believed itself experienced, battle-hardened, capable of weathering whatever the Americans and British could deliver. They were experienced. They were battle-hardened. But their experience was about to become obsolete in ways they could not have anticipated. Because while the Germans had been fighting on the Eastern Front, the Americans had been developing weapons at a pace and scale that German military planning had never accounted for. The industrial mobilization of the United States had produced not simply more of the same weapons, but entirely new categories of destruction. And among these was napalm. The substance itself was deceptively simple. The word derived from naphthenic and palmitic acids, the two original thickening agents used by Harvard chemist Louis Fieser in 1942 to create a gel that would make gasoline stick to targets. Before napalm, incendiary weapons had limited effectiveness. Gasoline burned too quickly and dispersed too easily. Standard thermite bombs were effective against structures but required direct hits. The development of napalm changed the fundamental calculus of PURI, incendiary warfare. The thickened gasoline burned at temperatures between 1470 and 2190 degrees Fahrenheit. Gasoline, by comparison, burned at just 495 degrees. More importantly, napalm adhered to whatever it touched and continued burning for extended periods. The American military had tested napalm extensively before deploying it in combat. At Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, engineers constructed buildings designed to replicate German and Japanese urban architecture. They wanted to understand exactly how napalm would perform against different target types. The results exceeded expectations. The substance proved extraordinarily effective against fortified positions, particularly those constructed of wood or other flammable materials. It could be delivered by aircraft in bombs or from the ground in flamethrowers. And it had one characteristic that made it particularly valuable in the close, overgrown terrain of Normandy. It could burn through vegetation. The hedgerows of Normandy had stymied American forces in the weeks following D-Day. These ancient agricultural barriers, thick earthen walls topped with dense vegetation, created thousands of small fortress positions. German defenders used them brilliantly, turning each field into a separate defensive position. American tanks struggled to break through. Infantry attacks became grinding battles of attrition. The bocage, as the French called this hedgerow country, seemed designed to negate American advantages in armor and mobility. Napalm changed this equation. When delivered by fighter bombers in strikes coordinated with ground attacks, the incendiary weapon transformed the hedgerows from defensive assets into liabilities. The thick vegetation that had provided such excellent cover now became fuel. And unlike conventional high explosive, which might crater a field or shatter a hedgerow but leave the defensive positions largely intact, napalm reached into the positions themselves. It flowed, it clung, it burned with an intensity that made survival nearly impossible. On that morning of July 25th, as part of Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, over 4,150 tons of high explosive and napalm fell on German positions along the Perrier-Saint-Lô road. 125,000 artillery rounds supplemented the aerial bombardment. The German Panzer Lehr Division, positioned to defend this sector, effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, later described the experience. His words were precise, clinical, the language of a professional soldier trying to convey something that professional military training had not prepared him to describe. The carpet bombing was like an earthquake. The ground shook. Half my men went mad. They ran in circles, screaming. But it was the fire bombs that destroyed us. We could take cover from the high explosive. We could survive the fragmentation. But the fire. The fire came into the bunkers. It came through the openings. It stuck to men and equipment. After 2 hours, my units were combat ineffective. After 4 hours, they had effectively ceased to exist. This was the pattern that would repeat across the Western Front through the remainder of the war. From Normandy to the Rhine, German forces encountered American tactical air power equipped with napalm. The weapon saw use during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when Allied aircraft dropped napalm on German armour concentrations and supply routes. It saw use during the Siege of La Rochelle, during the Falaise pocket fighting, during the crossing of the Rhine. By the war's end, more than 500,000 napalm bombs, approximately 10,000 tons of jellied fire, had fallen on German forces and German territory. The German soldiers who survived those first napalm strikes and lived to fight on through the autumn and Kaptevide. Winter of 1944 developed a vocabulary to describe what they experienced. They used words that had not appeared in previous after-action reports or unit journals. Führerwalze, fire roller, described the way napalm spread horizontally across defensive positions. Brandschock, burn shock, referred to the psychological state of troops who had witnessed men burning alive. Höllenfeuer, hellfire, appeared repeatedly in letters soldiers sent home before German censors began removing such descriptions. The statistics of German casualties from napalm strikes were never comprehensively compiled during the war itself. Unlike conventional artillery or small arms fire, which produced discrete, countable wounds, napalm casualties were often complete. Men caught in direct strikes did not become wounded soldiers, requiring evacuation and medical treatment. They became fatalities. Field hospitals reported unusual patterns in the casualties they did receive from napalm-affected areas. Severe burns, certainly, but also cases of asphyxiation, heat stroke, and what modern medicine would recognize as acute stress reactions. The weapon attacked not just bodies, but the fundamental sense of security that infantry combat required. Obergefreiter Hartmann's unit, remnants of the 352nd Infantry Division, withdrew from Normandy having lost 70% of its effective strength. The division journal, preserved in German military archives, lists casualties by corps. Artillery fire accounted for 32%, small arms and tank fire, 28%, air attack, 18%. Within that final category, a subcategory appears, Brandwaffen, incendiary weapons, responsible for 41% of air attack casualties. The journal's author, the division operations officer, added a marginal note that was not official but revealing nonetheless. Traditional defensive positions provide no protection against American fire weapons. New, tactical, doctrine required. That new doctrine never adequately developed. The Wehrmacht in the West spent the remainder of 1944 in continuous retreat, fighting, delaying actions, trying to establish defensive lines that American firepower would then systematically destroy. German military planning had accounted for material disadvantages. They understood the Americans possessed more tanks, more artillery, more ammunition. The answer had always been superior tactics, better training, more efficient use of resources. But napalm presented a problem that tactical sophistication could not solve. How does one defend a position that becomes uninhabitable the moment the enemy chooses to make it so? The contrast with Soviet weapons systems became a recurring theme in German unit journals and soldier letters from this period. References to the Katyusha appeared frequently, almost always in comparative contexts. A report from the 116th Panzer Division in September 1944 noted, Soviet rocket artillery produces high casualties through saturation effect, but allows for defensive countermeasures through dispersion and overhead cover. American incendiary weapons negate defensive construction and produce casualties even in properly prepared positions. A more visceral comparison appeared in a letter from Unteroffizier Wilhelm Becker, serving with Panzergrenadier Regiment 9. The letter, intercepted by American Signals Intelligence, was translated and filed in intelligence reports that have since been declassified. Becker wrote to his wife, "You asked about Russia and whether the fighting here in France is worse. In Russia we feared the Stalin organs. The sound they made was terrible and the explosions were terrible, but if you survived the barrage, you survived. Here the Americans drop fire from the sky and there is no surviving once it starts. The fire does not stop. It burns through the earth itself. I watch good men, soldiers who never broke in two, years of fighting, lose their minds when they see the fire coming, and I understand why. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This psychological dimension was precisely what German military intelligence had failed to anticipate. Wehrmacht psychological operations units, the Propagandatruppen, had extensive experience managing soldier morale on the Eastern Front. They understood the impact of heavy casualties. They understood how to maintain fighting spirit in the face of material disadvantage. They had developed sophisticated methods for sustaining unit cohesion, even during catastrophic defeats like Stalingrad. But those methods assumed that soldiers, however badly equipped or outnumbered, still operated within a framework where survival remained possible through skill and luck. Napalm disrupted that framework fundamentally. It introduced an element of helplessness that was qualitatively different from conventional weapons. A soldier in a foxhole during an artillery barrage might survive if the shells landed to either side. A soldier in a bunker during a tank attack might survive if the armor-piercing rounds failed to penetrate. But a soldier in a defensive position struck by napalm had no technical countermeasure available. The fire found you. The fire came into the position. The fire burned regardless of overhead cover or depth of excavation or quality of construction. Survival became a matter of not being in the impact zone when the weapon arrived, and the only way to guarantee that was to not be in defensive positions at all. This realization spread through German units on the Western Front during the late summer and autumn of 1944. It contributed to a phenomenon that German High Command found increasingly difficult to explain. Surrender rates increased dramatically. Between D-Day and October 17th, 610,541 German soldiers surrendered to Western Allied forces. This compared to approximately 200,000 captured on the Eastern Front during the same period, despite the Eastern Front being far larger and more active. The disparity continued through the winter. By the end of April 1945, 2.8 million German soldiers had surrendered to American and British forces, compared to roughly 800,000 to Soviet forces in the final months. Multiple factors explained this differential. Reasonable fear of Soviet captivity was significant. Many German soldiers believed, not without justification, that surrender to the Russians meant death or years in labor camps. Surrender to the Americans or British seemed to offer better prospects. But interviews with German prisoners of war, conducted by Allied intelligence services and preserved in military archives, reveal another consistent theme. They feared American weapons in ways they did not fear Soviet weapons. And among American weapons, incendiary munitions produced a specific, visceral fear that conventional arms did not. A representative interrogation report from November 1944, involving prisoners from the 275th Infantry Division captured near Aachen, included this exchange. The interrogator was a U.S. Army captain. The prisoner was an Obergefreiter who had served on both fronts. Q. You were transferred from the Eastern Front. How do the two fronts compare? A. In Russia, we fought soldiers. Here we fight machines and fire. Q. Explain what you mean by fire. A. Your aircraft drop fire bombs. The fire burns everything. In Russia, when the Katyushas fired, we took cover and waited. Here, when your planes come, there is no taking cover. The fire comes into the earth. Q. Did this affect your decision to surrender? A. I surrendered because continued fighting was suicide. In Russia, fighting was dangerous, but possible. Here, fighting is simply death. There is no defending against fire from the sky. This sentiment, expressed in various forms across hundreds of prisoner interrogations, represented something unprecedented in German military experience. The Wehrmacht had faced material disadvantage before. They had fought against numerically superior enemies. They had endured strategic bombing of German cities. But this was different. This was tactical helplessness, the recognition that at the small unit level, where wars are actually fought, German forces possessed no adequate response to a weapon system the Americans could deploy almost at will. The fundamental problem was industrial and technological. The German military had never developed napalm-equivalent weapons, not because German chemists lacked the capability, but because German strategic planning had not prioritized incendiary weapons for tactical use. German industry produced flamethrowers, certainly, but these were short-range weapons for assault operations, not area saturation munitions. The Luftwaffe had used incendiary bombs during the Blitz against British cities, but these were strategic weapons, not tactical support tools integrated with ground operations. The Wehrmacht simply had no equivalent to American tactical air power armed with napalm, and by 1944, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to develop one. American production of napalm represented industrial mobilization at a scale German planning had never adequately recognized. The substance itself was relatively simple to manufacture. The thickening agents could be produced in any chemical plant with basic organic chemistry capabilities. The United States had dozens of such facilities. By 1944, American industry produced napalm in bulk quantities, shipping it to Europe in powdered form, where it was mixed with gasoline immediately before use. The logistics were straightforward. The supply was effectively unlimited. Consider the mathematics. A single M69 napalm bomb weighed 6 pounds and contained jellied gasoline sufficient to cover 2,500 square yards when deployed properly. American production during 1944 and 1945 totaled several million such bombs. The 8th Air Force alone, operating from bases in Britain, dropped tens of thousands of tons of incendiaries on German targets. The 9th Air Force, providing tactical support to ground forces, dropped comparable amounts. American fighter bombers, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs and Lightnings routinely carried napalm canisters as standard armament for ground support missions. The disparity between American capacity to deliver incendiary weapons and German capacity to defend against them was not a matter of ratio. It was a matter of category. The Americans possessed a weapons system integrated into their tactical doctrine, supported by industrial production at scale, and deployed as a routine component of combined arms operations. The Germans possessed nothing equivalent, and no prospect of developing anything equivalent given their deteriorating industrial situation. German chemical plants were being destroyed by strategic bombing. German fuel production was collapsing as refineries and synthetic fuel facilities were eliminated. German tactical air power had been driven from the skies over Western Europe by overwhelming American fighter superiority. In this context, the comparison German soldiers made between napalm and Katyusha rockets becomes comprehensible, not as an objective assessment of weapon lethality, but as a psychological recognition of changed circumstances. The Katyusha was terrifying but comprehensible. It was a weapon system that fit within German military understanding. It could be studied, countered, adapted to. Soviet doctrine employed it in predictable ways. Its appearance on the battlefield followed patterns that German tactical intelligence could track, and anticipate. It was fearsome, but it was understandable. Napalm was something else. It represented technological and industrial capabilities that exceeded German frames of reference. It appeared when and where American commanders chose to deploy it, which meant whenever resistance needed to be broken or whenever German forces occupied positions that conventional weapons had not adequately suppressed. It killed in ways that German military medicine had limited capacity to treat, and it produced psychological effects that German military psychology had not encountered at scale before. It was not simply a more lethal weapon. It was a weapon that signaled the complete obsolescence of German defensive doctrine in the West. The turning point, the moment when this recognition moved from individual psychological reaction to institutional understanding, came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Hitler's last major offensive in the West, launched through the Ardennes, initially achieved tactical surprise and significant penetration of American lines. German armor, concentrated in ways not seen since 1941, pushed through weakly held sectors. For a brief period, it seemed possible that German forces might reach their objectives, splitting the Allied front and capturing the vital port of Antwerp. Then, the weather cleared. On December 23rd, after days of fog and overcast that had grounded Allied aircraft, the skies over the Ardennes turned brilliant blue. And the aircraft came, thousands of them. American and British fighters and fighter-bombers, freed from the weather constraints that had protected the German advance, fell upon the exposed German columns with devastating effect. They carried high-explosive bombs, they carried rockets, and they carried napalm. The result was catastrophic. German units that had advanced rapidly through forested terrain suddenly found themselves trapped on frozen roads with no cover from air attack. American P-47s swept in low, their .850 caliber machine guns chewing up soft-skinned vehicles, their bombs and napalm canisters setting fuel trucks and supply vehicles ablaze. The frozen ground, which had initially aided German movement by hardening muddy roads, now prevented proper entrenchment. Foxholes could not be dug into earth frozen solid. The forests, which had provided concealment during the initial advance, became obstacles during retreat. General-Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, whose Panzer Lehr division had been reconstituted after its destruction in Normandy, experienced the same weapon that had shattered his command 6 months earlier. His division war diary, preserved in German military archives, records losses on December 24th alone. 31 tanks destroyed, 54 half-tracks and trucks burned, estimated casualties exceeding 600 men. The entry's final line reads, "Air attack with incendiary weapons made continued offensive operations impossible. Units withdrew to defensive positions. But there were no defensive positions, not against this kind of attack." German forces in the Bulge found themselves subject to the same helplessness that their counterparts in Normandy had experienced. The weapons that had made them effective on the Eastern Front, the tactical proficiency that had sustained them through years of war, meant nothing against an enemy who could deliver fire from the sky at will. By early January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed. American forces had not simply stopped the advance, they had systematically destroyed German capacity to maintain offensive operations through application of overwhelming air power. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound and lasting. A report from OB West, the Wehrmacht's Western Command, dated January 8, 1945, noted, "Troop morale significantly degraded following Ardennes offensive. Soldiers report feelings of helplessness against enemy air superiority and incendiary weapons. Units transferred from Eastern Front demonstrate lower combat effectiveness in West than previous performance suggests they should possess. Assessment indicates soldiers fear Western Allied weapons, particularly aircraft-delivered incendiaries, more than Soviet weapons, including massed artillery." This was the collision of belief with reality, the moment when German military confidence, built on 3 years of successful Eastern Front operations, encountered the full industrial and technological superiority of American warfare. The soldiers who made the comparison between napalm and katyushas were not making a technical assessment of weapon lethality. They were expressing a fundamental recognition that the war they knew how to fight was not the war they were fighting. On the Eastern Front, courage and skill and tactical proficiency mattered. In the West, those qualities seemed irrelevant against an enemy who possessed the material means to simply obliterate defensive positions without engaging in the kind of infantry combat German doctrine prepared soldiers to win. The recognition that American incendiary weapons represented a qualitatively different threat than Soviet artillery fundamentally altered German tactical behavior in the final months of the war. This shift manifested in ways both obvious and subtle. Units transferred from the Eastern Front to the West demonstrated measurably lower combat effectiveness than their previous records suggested they should possess. Desertion rates increased dramatically. Surrender rates, already high, accelerated further, as German soldiers concluded that continued resistance in the West served no purpose beyond prolonging inevitable death. The numbers tell part of the story. Between January and April 1945, approximately 1.5 million German soldiers surrendered to Western Allied forces. This compared to roughly 800,000 captured by Soviet forces during the same period, despite the Eastern Front encompassing far more territory and far more combat divisions. German units facing the Red Army continued fighting with desperate intensity, conducting tactical withdrawals, establishing defensive lines, contesting every kilometre of territory. German units facing American and British forces increasingly simply stopped fighting. The reasons were complex, certainly. Fear of Soviet captivity was real and justified. German propaganda had spent years emphasizing the brutality soldiers could expect if captured by the Red Army. And while this propaganda was exaggerated, it was not entirely fabricated. Soviet treatment of German prisoners ranged from harsh to lethal. German soldiers knew this. They knew that surrender in the East meant, at best, years of imprisonment in Siberian labor camps. Many chose to fight on rather than face that fate. But interviews with German prisoners taken by Western Allied forces reveal another consistent pattern. They did not surrender primarily because they believed American or British captivity would be pleasant. They surrendered because they believed continued fighting against Western Allied forces was pointless. The weapons disparity was too great. The tactical situation was too hopeless. The psychological toll of facing napalm and massed tactical air power had broken something fundamental in their willingness to continue. A representative account comes from Hauptmann Erich Schneider, captured near Remagen in March 1945. Schneider had commanded a company in the 952nd Grenadier Regiment. He had served on the Eastern Front from 1941 through 1944, participating in the siege of Leningrad, the retreat from Ukraine, and defensive operations in Belorussia. His service record indicated 5 wound badges, an Iron Cross First Class, and multiple commendations for tactical proficiency. He was, by any measure, an experienced and capable officer. His interrogation report, preserved in U.S. Army intelligence archives, is remarkably candid. Asked why he surrendered rather than continuing to resist, Schneider replied, "In Russia, we knew how to fight. We understood Soviet tactics. We knew their weapons. When Katyushas fired, we took cover. When their tanks attacked, we had Panzerfausts. When their infantry advanced, we fought them. Here, your aircraft come, and there is no fighting them. The firebombs fall, and there is no defending against them. I lost half my company in 2 air attacks, not in battle, not in combat where soldiers fight soldiers, just burning. Men burning in positions they could not leave. I will not order soldiers to die that way. I surrendered because the war here cannot be fought by soldiers. It can only be endured until you decide we have suffered enough." This sentiment, expressed in various forms across thousands of prisoner interrogations, represented a fundamental shift in German military psychology. The Wehrmacht had endured catastrophic defeats before. They had lost entire armies at Stalingrad and in Tunisia. They had suffered strategic reversals that cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. But they had continued fighting, sustained by belief that tactical proficiency and soldier quality could compensate for material disadvantages. The Western Front in 1945 destroyed that belief, not through a single catastrophic defeat, but through accumulated recognition that the war Americans were fighting was simply different. The long-term consequences extended well beyond the immediate military situation. The German officers and soldiers who survived the war and returned home carried with them a specific understanding of American military power that would influence post-war German thinking about warfare and international relations. They had experienced firsthand the capabilities of a fully mobilized industrial economy focused on military production. They had seen what happened when a nation possessed both the technological sophistication to develop advanced weapons systems and the industrial capacity to deploy those systems at scale. This understanding shaped post-war German military doctrine in ways both obvious and subtle. When West Germany re-established armed forces in the 1950s as part of NATO, German military planning accepted certain fundamental premises that would have seemed unthinkable to Wehrmacht commanders of the 1940s. German forces would never again attempt to fight a major war through tactical superiority, compensating for material inferiority. German defense planning would prioritize integration with allies, particularly the United States, who possessed the industrial and technological capabilities that modern warfare required. German military education emphasized combined arms operations, joint force coordination, and the absolute necessity of air superiority in any future conflict. These were lessons learned not from studying American military doctrine in abstract terms, but from experiencing American military power at the receiving end. The officers who rebuilt the Bundeswehr, the Federal Defense Force, were in many cases veterans of the Western Front. They remembered what napalm did to defensive positions. They remembered what it felt like to be unable to defend against weapons delivered from the air. They remembered the psychological impact of facing an enemy who possessed capabilities that seemed to render conventional defensive tactics obsolete. And they structured their new military accordingly, accepting that future German forces would fight as part of an alliance system rather than as an independent military power. The contrast with Soviet military thinking is instructive. The Red Army emerged from World War II with a very different set of lessons. Soviet forces had defeated the Wehrmacht through massive application of artillery, armor, and infantry in operations of unprecedented scale. Soviet casualties were staggering, but Soviet victory was total. Post-war Soviet military doctrine emphasized massed firepower, deep operations, and the application of overwhelming force. The Katyusha rocket system that had terrorized German soldiers on the Eastern Front became the template for decades of Soviet multiple rocket launcher development. Soviet military planning accepted high casualties as inevitable in modern warfare and structured forces accordingly. American military thinking, shaped by very different wartime experiences, evolved along different lines. The United States emerged from World War II, having demonstrated that industrial capacity, technological superiority, and firepower could substitute for the kind of mass casualties that characterized Eastern Front operations. American doctrine emphasized precision strike capabilities, air superiority, technological advantage, and the application of overwhelming firepower before committing ground forces to combat. Napalm, which had proven so effective in the final year of the European War, remained in the American arsenal through Korea and Vietnam, always controversial, always devastating when employed. The German soldiers who compared napalm unfavorably to Katyusha rockets were, in their way, identifying a fundamental truth about the evolution of warfare in the industrial age. The weapons that armies fielded increasingly reflected not tactical requirements or strategic necessity, but simply what their industrial and technological base allowed them to produce. The Soviet Union could manufacture millions of rockets and launch them from simple truck-mounted rails. The United States could manufacture jellied gasoline, deliver it by aircraft, and deploy it with precision against tactical targets. Both approaches were effective. But the American approach produced specific psychological effects that massed artillery did not. effects that German soldiers at the receiving end understood better than any strategic analysis could capture. The story of German fears of American napalm versus Soviet Katyusha rockets is ultimately not a story about comparative weapon lethality. Both weapons killed effectively. Both produced casualties at rates that would horrify modern sensibilities. The Katyusha probably killed more German soldiers in absolute numbers, simply because it was deployed in greater quantities across a larger theatre for a longer period. But lethality measured in body counts misses the essential point. The essential point is psychological. It is about what weapons represent to the soldiers who face them. The Katyusha represented brute force, the application of massed firepower in ways that were terrifying but comprehensible. It fit within German military understanding of how wars were fought. It could be countered through tactical measures. It could be survived through proper defensive preparation. It was terrible, but it was familiar. Napalm represented something else entirely. It represented technological and industrial superiority at a level that German forces had no capacity to match. It produced casualties that could not be prevented through tactical skill or defensive construction. It created psychological effects that German military psychology had not adequately prepared soldiers to endure, and it signaled, more clearly than any strategic assessment or propaganda message, that Germany had lost the industrial war that ultimately determined military outcomes in the 20th century. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. His unit, reduced to less than 20% of authorized strength, simply stopped fighting when American forces surrounded their position. The unit war diary's final entry, written by Hartmann himself after the company commander had fled, reads, "No ammunition, no fuel, no orders. American aircraft overhead. Hartmann spent 14 months in a prisoner of war camp before repatriation to Germany. In interviews conducted decades later for German television documentaries about the war, he was asked repeatedly about his combat experiences. Interviewers wanted to hear about the Eastern Front, about Stalingrad, about the great battles that shaped the war's outcome. Hartmann spoke of those experiences briefly and factually, but when asked what he remembered most vividly from the war, his answer was consistent. The fire, the napalm strikes in Normandy, the way men burned, the helplessness of facing a weapon that defensive measures could not defeat. In one interview, conducted in 1987, when Hartmann was 68 years old, he was asked directly about the comparison between Eastern and Western Front combat. His response captures something essential about the soldier's experience of industrial warfare. People ask which front was worse. In Russia, we fought an enemy we understood. They had more men, more tanks, more artillery, but we knew how to fight them. We knew that skill and courage mattered. In France, against the Americans, skill did not matter, courage did not matter. They simply burned everything, and we could do nothing about it. That is worse than any battle, to know that nothing you do makes any difference. This recognition, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in the final year of the war, helps explain why German resistance in the West collapsed so much more rapidly than resistance in the East. It was not simply that Soviet captivity was more feared than American captivity, though that was true. It was that fighting against Soviet forces seemed to offer some possibility of military success through tactical proficiency, while fighting against American forces seemed to offer only death by fire from weapons that could not be countered. The legacy of this psychological dynamic extends beyond World War II. Modern military forces understand that the psychological impact of weapons can matter as much as their actual lethality. Precision-guided munitions, drone strikes, overwhelming firepower applied from ranges where return fire is impossible. All these produce effects on enemy morale that go beyond simple casualty counts. They produce the same sense of helplessness that German soldiers felt facing napalm in 1944 and 1945. The recognition that the enemy possesses capabilities you cannot match, that survival depends not on your skill, but simply on whether the enemy chooses to employ their superior weapons against your position. The German soldiers, who feared American napalm more than Soviet Katyusha rockets, were not making an irrational assessment. They were recognizing a fundamental truth about industrial warfare, that technological and material superiority, when applied systematically and at scale, can render traditional military virtues irrelevant. Courage cannot stop firebombs. Training cannot counter air superiority. Tactical proficiency means nothing when the enemy can simply obliterate your positions without engaging in the kind of combat your doctrine prepares you to fight. This was the lesson of 1944 and 1945 on the Western Front. It was a lesson written in fire and learned through the accumulated psychological trauma of soldiers who discovered that everything they knew about warfare had become obsolete. The comparison between napalm and Katyusha rockets, made by German soldiers in letters and interviews and prisoner interrogations, was ultimately a comparison between two different kinds of warfare, two different military systems, two different visions of how industrial nations fought, and for the soldiers caught between these visions, the choice was clear. Better to face weapons you understood, even if they killed efficiently, than to face weapons that made you helpless. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.